Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, the podcast that looks at geopolitics in historical context with myself, Ali Ansari, and my comrade in arms, Suzanne Rain. Today we're going to be talking about the Norway-Russia border. Some of you will have noticed that we omitted this in our last podcast, looking at the enormity of the Russian state, but I can confirm to you today that that was deliberate, because today we're going to look specifically at the Norway-Russia border, of which I understand, Suzanne, you have been looking at in some detail.
I have, Ali, that's right. I knew already a little bit about it because I've been to it, but I've also since then been doing quite a lot more research, both historical and modern, and I'm hoping that between us we can have quite an interesting discussion actually about this. It's only a short border.
Yeah, you must be one of the few people to have been up there by the sounds of it. I mean, I
think there's quite a lot of people.
Secluded spot. Oh, is there? Okay.
I think there's quite a lot of people who've been there, Ali. Should we start with some basic facts and then we can...
Basic facts, yeah.
Basic facts. And again, although this is a podcast, having an understanding of what it looks like on a map is important. The reason we forgot about it, or didn't forget about it, but didn't remember to mention it, is because it's quite short. The actual land border is just shy of 200 kilometres, about 123 miles. There's also obviously a marine border, and there's a border that goes in the fjord, which is about 23 kilometres long in Varanga Fjord. But it's across if you think of Norway essentially as being largely north-south, but it's around the top of Norway and coming down the other side is where the actual border is with Russia. It's way into the Arctic Circle, and the main Norwegian town on the border is a place called Kirkenes, which is 69 degrees north and 30 degrees east. And just in case, Ali, that you haven't exactly worked out where 30 degrees east is, it's the same line as Istanbul and Alexandria. So when we think of Norway as being a Western European country, but in fact that boundary over with the border with Russia is actually as far east as Istanbul. So that's a little bit of geography for you. It's also as far away from Oslo as Oslo is from Rome. So again, just the scale of the country.
Quite extraordinary.
And as you were mentioning to me, what's your one fact that you definitely know about this border?
Well, the one fact that I definitely know is it seems to be one of the oldest borders in the world. In fact, agreed between Norway and Novgorod in 1326, I understand.
Well, yes, I can't work out exactly who signed this treaty, but it's really interesting because you're right, it's really old. And I mean, it seems to have been very much redrafted and reestablished in 1826. So how many is that? 500 years later. Yeah. But that original treaty between Novgorod and Norway was essentially to regulate spheres of influence in Finnmark, which is still that kind of area in the north of Norway, north of Finland, north of Sweden. And in Russian terms, it's called the Kola Peninsula, which is actually a big thumb of land that comes eastwards out of that area. And that's been forever the place where the Sami people live. And they don't consider themselves to be particularly Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish or Russian, but they are the Sami people. They have their own language, they have their own parliaments. And so that treaty was essentially creating a buffer zone where different interested parties saw themselves as having rights over the indigenous Sami people who lived there. So if you look up about the Treaty of Novgorod, it will essentially say it was about who had the right to exploit the resources that were there in terms of taxing the indigenous people or in terms of getting fish and fur from the region. And there's not an awful lot else that you would do except exploit resources and tax the locals, I suppose.
I mean, it seems to have been in its origins, as a sort of a declared borderland, a sort of a marcher territory where it was a bit of a no man's land between the two territories, but obviously they had designated it as this sort of borderland. And then obviously in the later 19th century, when you get that formal treaty, you then get the boundaries becoming much more defined.
Yes, but this is what makes the whole thing so interesting, because it is a critical border now between Norway and Russia, but actually between NATO and Russia. And it has been been for a long time. So during the Cold War, the border was one of only two between NATO and the Soviet Union. There was this little border up in Norway and Turkey. And then it all gets complicated after 1991, where the pack shuffles. And from 1991 to 1999, this little border was the only border between Russia and NATO. So it's kind of a border on the front line. And yet, at the same time, it's always been a little bit different from other state borders because of the reach of the indigenous Sami people, who don't recognise the borders in the same way. So that means that you've always had to have this sense of people being able to move backwards and forwards between, if you're a herder or a fisherman, you need to be able to move your stock.
I mean, in that sense, it's a fluid border in that sense. So on the one hand, it's the one boundary, as you say, between the Soviet Union and NATO, effectively, during the Cold War. And yet at the same time, it's a border where you've got to allow the indigenous people to basically move across that border. It's very fluid. I mean, it's a bit of a paradox, really, isn't it?
Well, the actual border's not fluid. I mean, the border stays where it is. But what is interesting,
to let people move across it.
So there's got to be a functioning relationship between Russia and Norway. And I think they pride themselves, actually, despite everything, in however bad relations might be between NATO and Russia, Norway and Russia continue to have, and we can go into this in more detail later on, they continue to have a cooperative relationship regarding the Barents Sea, regarding maritime conservation, regarding fisheries, and that has been conscious. So I think Norway is the only European country that Russia hasn't been to war with. There is a relationship there, which is important. So, shall I tell you, Ali, what got me interested in this in the first place? I've got this fantastic book called Norway's Arctic Highway, which was written by a man called John Douglas, who was my husband's classics teacher a long time ago. And he started exploring in the 60s around the north of Norway and went up to the North Cape. And he wrote this book about the Arctic Highway, which is the road that goes now across the north of Norway from the Arctic Circle, goes right the way up through all the fjords, past all the fjords, and then around the top to Kirkenes, to the border. And this road didn't used to exist. I mean, if you think of the Norwegian coast or the way of life in northern Norway being not dissimilar to the way of life in northern Scotland and in Ireland before modern transportation, where essentially you had coastal fishing communities who communicated more easily by sea than by land. The land was impassable, there were sharp ravines. Yes. So you just got on a boat and you went around the coast. So there weren't roads. And then during the course of the 19th and earlier 20th centuries, they started building an Arctic highway that would take you essentially all the way up the spine of Norway and across to Kirkenes at the top. And I mean, it was slow going because Norway was poor. Don't forget, this was before they found oil, which was only a very recent discovery. So, and it was slow going because you had to keep stopping being on the road and getting a little ferry across the fjord and then getting on another road. And then it was only in the sort of 1920s and 30s that the construction of this road really took off. And that turned out arguably to have been bad timing, because then when the Germans invaded, they said, oh, brilliant, a road, and we just need to finish it off a bit, and then it'll be incredibly helpful, and we can essentially drive all the way up. And there's probably historians turning in their graves. But that's what happened. And the reason I've brought all this in, Ali, is... So
did the Germans finish it off?
Well, that's exactly...
Did the Germans actually finish it off?
That's exactly. The Germans did finish it off, but the reason I brought this in is because the Germans finished it off by using forced labour from people in whose countries Germany now, and particularly the Russians. So basically, they brought prisoners of war, captives, thousands of them, from Russia and from Central and Southern Europe, and they came and they built the Arctic Highway, which was obviously terrible working conditions. Thousands of them perished from cold, malnutrition, arbitrary execution, kind of typical Nazi labour practices. And so the Arctic Highway became known then as the Blood Road. And if you travel along it now, particularly there's a place called Mo i Rana, where there are stones which memorialise the Russians and other prisoners of war or forced labourers who the Germans brought into North Norway to build the road. So it's not an uncomplicated history, and it's actually a really interesting example where in fact, it was the Russians who were the victims in this part of Norway at that time. And then, of course, the Germans went right up to the top and over. And it wasn't until 1944 that they started to be pushed back again out of Norway from the north. And the Russians came over into Kirkenes and the Germans withdrew south. And again, I mean, it's hardly covered anywhere outside the area, but as the Germans withdrew south from Kirkenes back south down into Norway, they carried out a really extensive scorched earth policy. They burned everything. And there are people who lived in Kirkenes.
I had no idea it was actually a fighting front.
Yes. So already, Ali, you've learned something.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I mean,
I've definitely learned something here.
It was quite brutally occupied by the Germans. During World War II, Kirkenes was subject to 320 air raids, so more than anywhere else apart from Malta. And at the end of the war, the town was basically burnt to the ground by the Germans. And in the summer of 1944, the population of Kirkenes basically lived in the mine. It's a mining town. There's a lot, we'll talk about mining as well, but you had over 3,500 people spent the summer in underground while the Russians came in. 10 children were born in the mine, so on their birth certificate, it's basically underground during that. And then the Russian army drove out the Germans. The other interesting thing is because most of the buildings were made of wood, it was very easy everything burnt. And then the population of Kirkenes after the war, they were so determined to just rebuild that they rebuilt in quite a brutal way, i.e. they didn't put effort into making it look lovely. They just said, this is our place, we're going to rebuild it again. So it's another example of the sort of the human spirit triumphing over complete destruction. So that's what it's like now. On the other side of the border, and just looking at the map again, it's quite interesting because you don't realise until you look at a map how close Murmansk and Archangel, or I can't pronounce it in the Russian way, Arkhangelsk, how close they are to Norway. How much do you know about the Arctic convoys?
Well, I know a little bit. I've obviously read up about this, and this was something actually, you're quite right, that struck me, of course, because wasn't it here in Murmansk and Archangel that these Arctic convoys were meant to have? Is that where they docked? I mean, wasn't it also something that prior to the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, there were also German ships that would actually move into the Arctic Circle and would dock in these places. So this must have been a fairly sort of vulnerable area, a fairly sensitive area of conduct, particularly as the Germans were moving up there prior, when they were allied with the Soviet Union. But it is very close. I mean, you're quite right. You look at the map. I mean, when we say very close, it looked close on the map, by the way. I'm sure there's just hundreds and hundreds of miles. But still, I mean, you don't really, you don't realise how close. I mean, Norway, I suppose the thing is that the Norwegian border is fairly close to Murmansk.
Exactly. The Norwegian border is fairly close to Murmansk. And again, this is why it's all so strategically significant. And it's not just because all of these countries converge here. It's also because of the North Atlantic, whatever it's called, the North Atlantic Drift, the current of warm water that comes across the Atlantic that makes
the currents,
makes the British Isles so temperate in comparative terms. And that's what gives, I mean, it is still really cold up there, but you have this flow of warmish water that comes along the north coast of Norway and then round through the Barents Sea, which is what essentially makes it passable in a way that it wouldn't be if it were at that latitude somewhere else. So again, so you have this piece of water, marine territory, which is between the Norwegian Sea on the west of Norway and the Barents Sea, which goes around the top of Norway and into where Murmansk and Archangel are, which is passable and therefore usable. And that was why in the Second World War, that was the critical piece of water for the Arctic convoys, which were supply ships taking military supplies and provisions and whatever was necessary to Russia. This is only obviously after Russia, the Soviet Union, came in on the side of the Allies in the war. Up to that point, it wasn't. So I was going to, Ali, because I really care about this, I was going to just tell you the story of the Battle of the North Cape. Well, I'm going to try, and I am not just so we're clear, I am not a military historian and I'm definitely not a naval historian, but I went to the North Cape and it's the first time that I really understood the importance of naval battles and I started to feel the sort of excitement of them. So what was happening? The Allies were sending convoys from Britain or from America across to Murmansk, through round the top of Norway, through the Barents Sea. And in the Battle of the Murmansk convoys from 1941 to 1945, there were enormous losses on all sides. They lost 62 full and 28 empty freighters and 19 escort vessels. They were sunk. About approximately 2,700 Allied seamen, civilians and military personnel were killed. And for the Germans, they lost the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst, and at least 15 German U-boats, so approximately 3,700 men. But I think those numbers don't actually really give you a sense of the horror of it. So the convoys were normally about 30 cargo ships, and they would be then accompanied by lots of sort of cruisers whose job would be essentially to defend the convoys. And then under the sea...
destroyers, yeah. To basically...
and then under the sea, you'd have the U-boats as well. So you've got this sort of Arctic hunting ground. And the thing that was causing the most problem was this German battlecruiser Scharnhorst, which was an incredibly capable battlecruiser that was just consistently attacking the convoys. So there was a man called Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, and he was responsible for the home fleet. And he decided he was going to neutralise Scharnhorst through a cunning ruse. And the cunning ruse was to use one of the convoys heading to Russia as bait. And this action took place in December 1943. So what are the other things, Ali, because we've established the answer's not very much, what are the other things that you know about December in the Arctic? What do you think it's going to be like in December?
What are the other things that I know?
Yeah, what just...
Well, I think it's going to be extremely cold and
Yes?
probably and probably ice, lots of ice.
Okay, what else? Because you're in the high north. So what happens in December in the high north?
Oh, it's going to be extremely dark.
There is no daylight.
It's going to be dark.
It's going to be dark. There's
no daylight at all.
Daylight because you have this thing called the blue hour, which is essentially where the sun doesn't come above the horizon, but you get the light echoing from it. But it is dark all the time. So here you had Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser says we're going to use convoy JW55B as bait for the Scharnhorst. The Scharnhorst, and this is where you've got to sort of start seeing it as not just a battlecruiser, but a sort of an entity with an identity. The Scharnhorst it used to hide in Alta Fjord, which is a long, deep fjord just by Alta, which is a town on the west coast actually, but in Finnmark, so not so far away from the North Cape. So it would sneak into Alta Fjord and it would hide there. And the Norwegian resistance, who were fabulous all the way through the war, they had a critical role in this because they had been given the job of watching the Scharnhorst and notifying the British when it was leaving the Alta Fjord. So they had a man, I'm going to give you, there's a few Norwegian names, but they should be remembered, so I'm going to try and say them. There was a radio telegraphist.
I'm looking forward to listening to your pronunciation.
I'm going to do my best. Yeah. So there are four characters here, but there's radio telegraphist Torsten Roby, and he was camouflaged as a county roads office employee under his paymaster, Carl Rasmussen, who was also in on it. And then there was an agent at Kofjord called Harry Peterson, and he had a contact called Jens Digre in Langfjorden. And on Christmas Day at 7 p.m, they all called each other, essentially Digre called Pettersson, who called Rasmussen, leaving the coded message, "Grandmother has left on her Christmas holiday." And what do you think that meant, Ali?
Did that mean the Scharnhorst had left or something? Or the Scharnhorst was en route or something like this?
Yes, you would have been
I'd be good at this. I'd be good at this.
If you were a German radio interceptor, you'd know exactly what was going on. Grandmother has left on her Christmas holiday, and Torsten Roby immediately telegraphed Britain, and he was later honoured for that, and notified them that the Scharnhorst was on the way. And he was never caught, actually, although Rasmussen was, and he was arrested and tortured, and he committed suicide rather than reveal his contacts. So Admiral Fraser received confirmation from the Admiralty in the early hours of the 26th of December that the Scharnhorst was at sea and it was searching for for the convoy. This is where the weather and the darkness are critical to everything. So it was incredibly stormy. The Luftwaffe couldn't get their reconnaissance planes up there, so they couldn't search for the British ships. And so the Scharnhorst was trying to sort of locate the convoy itself. And it was sailing round and round in that bit off the North Cape, looking, Admiral Bay, who was in charge of the Scharnhorst, he was looking for the British convoy. He thought he'd gone too far, and so he came back again. And at that point, HMS Belfast, now you can go and visit it. It's now on the Thames.
Ooh.
It belongs to the Imperial
I know a
War
lot about the
Museum.
HMS Belfast.
Do you? What do you know about HMS?
Well, I've been on it.
Well,
Nothing really. I mean, except that I've actually been on it. Yeah.
Well, it's a fantastic day out, and actually it has some really good displays that make you think about what it would have been like to be at the Battle of the North Cape. So HMS Belfast,
yeah, absolutely,
was there, and it obtained radar contact on the Scharnhorst, and a bunch of British cruisers. Sorry, again, that's not naval words, rapidly closed on the Scharnhorst. And there you had this extraordinary thing where the Scharnhorst was bigger and faster than any of the British ships, but it didn't have as good radar capabilities and it didn't have the communications. So British cruisers opened fire, the Scharnhorst responded, and the Scharnhorst didn't hit any British ships, but the Scharnhorst was hit twice. And one shell destroyed the forward radar controls. And that was critical because it left it blind. So it's pitch dark. It's a snowstorm. It
couldn't see. Yeah.
So, and this is where you sort of, if you think of it as a woolly mammoth being hunted by ancient huntspeople, suddenly, even though it's this enormous ship, it's got all these capabilities. But
where do you find these analogies from? I think it's quite a good analogy for the area we're thinking of.
But this Ali, this is what happened. So this enormous ship that had been the scourge of the convoys still has all these capabilities, but it can't see, and it is pitch dark, it's snowing, everything is icing up. So if you think every time a wave comes over the bow, it's just icing up. And so once it was blinded, it tried to run away. I mean, it tried to sort of shake off its pursuers. Then it didn't give up trying to attack the convoy, but it started to move kind of erratically because it didn't know where they were and it couldn't see. Meanwhile, the British cruisers and destroyers, again, I mean, they can't really see it, but they do have the radar, and so they pursue it. It's not fair to say that British didn't have their own problems. You had a number of them with engine problems. And there was a stage where HMS Belfast, you can go and see it on the Thames, it's fantastic, was the only pursuer. So this dogged little ship pursuing this massive German battle cruiser, which I think they were all a bit concerned about. And then finally, so the Belfast was sending constant stream of radio signals saying this is where the Scharnhorst is. And then the British battleship, the Duke of York, battled through the rough seas, reached the German ship. And then you had essentially what I imagine as being a typical naval battle with, broadsides being fired. The Belfast fired some star shells into the sky, which illuminated the Scharnhorst, and it was then sunk. I'm cutting a long story short, with the loss of almost all of their men. So that's that.
So what's the, looking at, we've got the historical basis, we've got we've settled on this border that's basically established in the 14th century, but, defined probably in 1826. Then obviously we've got the experience of the Cold War. What, Suzanne, is the relevance and the importance of this border for us today? What does that tell us about the situation today and with Putin's Russia as your neighbour? How do the Norwegians feel about that?
One of the things that is noteworthy about this is the fact that Norway and Russia continue to cooperate and will continue to cooperate, and they've both been quite clear that they will do. And there's two reasons I think that are driving that cooperation. It's the coexistence in the Barents Sea, and there's agreements in place around fishing and around environmental protection, which have been hard won over the last 50 years, and which, even despite the Russian invasion of Ukraine, continue to exist. So the only ongoing cooperation between Norway and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was on fisheries management, which was based on agreements from the 50s and the 70s. There's quite a lot of Norwegian unhappiness, or has been over a long period of time, about environmental damage that was headed towards Norway from what the Russians were doing on the Russian side. You had a place called Nikel, which is part of a large Russian nickel mine, which is just on the other side. And in Kirkenes in the 1980s, people protested against death clouds from the nickel smelters just over the border. And there was this great fear that pollution, oil and radioactivity could be transported through the Siberian rivers into the Arctic Ocean and then into the Barents Sea. There's actually also, Ali, up there, a sort of large island archipelago called Novaya Zemlya, where the Russians conducted a series of nuclear tests. And again, that sort of borders onto the Barents Sea. So there's been, for a very long time, this sort of concern about how to cohabit, but also how to protect the environment, how to protect fisheries. There's an intergovernmental agreement from 1992, which agreed that. And so 1992 is a noteworthy date because that's obviously after the end of the Soviet Union, when Norway and Russia agreed to work together. And they've now got, certainly on the Norwegian side, they've got a plan on protecting environment resources, and they balance out fish stock every year. So they've reached an agreement this year, for example, on how many fish should be fished. And the Norwegian Minister of Fisheries and Maritime Affairs has said that Russians will still be allowed to fish in the Norwegian zone, and they'll still be allowed to land the fish in Norwegian ports. And that's despite, obviously, because the EU has obviously imposed sanctions and restrictions on what Russian ships can do. But the Norwegian position is all of these agreements have been hard won, and they're very important to us. So we are going to make sure that we maintain collaboration, or not collaboration, maybe that sounds wrong, but a cooperative relationship with Russia on fisheries. So that's the Norwegian position on that.
But aside from sort of management of the resources and the, environmental side of things, do you think there's actually is there a military threat or problem with that border, or is it really being managed in a way that is out of sync in a way, or out of character with the rest of the relationship? I saw the Norwegians and the other Scandinavian countries were obviously busy putting up a show of solidarity and force to deter any Russian attempts. Obviously we don't think they're necessarily going to be piling over the Norwegian border, but at the same time it is a military border. There are some sensitivities to that border, I take.
This is where that land border, I think, is the least of our worries in a way, because you're right. The land border, as we've established, is kind of fixed. It's been sort of fixed since 1326. There's nothing in it for the Russians really to try and they're not going to do that. But if you look at a map, the bit that really matters to them all is the Barents Sea, which is the sea. So then you end up trying to understand how the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea impacts on the exclusive economic zone. So you have a sovereign state has special rights regarding exploration and use of marine resources, including energy production from water and wind, from the outer limit of the territorial sea to about 200 nautical miles. That's your exclusive economic zone. So you've got, if you sort of draw, the reason it becomes complicated, because if you draw lines up from Norway and up from Russia, they're both coming up into the Barents Sea. And that right to exploit use marine resources there is an attractive one, but has the potential to become a competitive one. And Norway and Russia negotiated for 40 years from the before that, but from 1970 to 2010, negotiations were ongoing between the two about essentially how to demarcate whose exclusive economic zone was where in the Barents Sea. And they finally signed a treaty on September the 15th, 2010, foreign ministers from Norway and Russia, on maritime delimitation and cooperation in the Barents Sea and the Arctic Ocean. That's important because part of that treaty opens up the possibility of hydrocarbon exploration. So while there wasn't a treaty, there was a kind of moratorium on hydrocarbon. And now and the treaty makes possible hydrocarbon exploration because it essentially agrees that they they will share it. So even if they find it in one, they will enable the other also to explore. Again, I'm massively simplifying. I can see you with your head in your hands. Jens Stoltenberg has a role in this because he was Prime Minister of Norway at the time that this was all agreed, and he is, of course, now
that's right, yeah.
Secretary General of NATO. So a recent assessment by the US Geological Survey estimated that there might be something like 11 billion barrels of crude oil and 380 trillion cubic feet of natural gas under or in the Barents Sea shelf. So that's a lot. And this...
That does make it. There's a factoid. Another thing I've learned.
Sorry, Ali, you're just being bombarded with facts from me.
I'm blown away.
But that's, who knows what's going to happen. So obviously this is bad timing for lots of reasons, because hydrocarbons aren't fashionable at the moment, and Norway already has been having complicated conversations within itself about what to do with the fact that it's become wealthy through hydrocarbons, but actually, wants to be ecologically sound. So there's an argument against further exploration for hydrocarbons on ecological grounds. And the second,
presumably one of the advantages the Norwegians have over the Russians, although again, you don't need to answer this if you don't know the answer, by the way, but one of the advantages they may have is that they have more experience of offshore drilling. I mean, having had all that experience in the North Sea, obviously. So presumably all this oil and gas has to be sort of extricated. I don't know whether the Russians do, but presumably they don't have the same type of experience and the same type of access to sort of equipment.
I assume not either, although they've obviously got a lot of experience of mining in Siberia. But the problem at the moment is that anything which the Norwegians do has to be shared with the Russians through this treaty. And of course, the West really does have sanctions on Russian oil and gas. So what exactly is made of these potential hydrocarbon resources in the Barents Sea, I think is still not clear, certainly to me. I'm sure some of our listeners will put us right.
Another fascinating aspect of it, of course, is that around Murmansk is actually the base of the Russian Northern Fleet, which I think is probably the oldest of the Russian fleets, founded in 1733. Can you believe it? And obviously, part of the expansion or part of the determination of the Russians to also look westwards eventually. But it was a significant naval base throughout the Cold War, but somewhat neglected post Cold War. And if you remember, there was that tragedy over one of the submarines. I think it was called the Kursk. That basically the death of 118 sailors or so. That was one of the submarines from actually the Northern Fleet, and I think it was sort of signified or was emblematic of the decline, I suppose, of that fleet really in the post-Cold War, I should say, period. But then, interestingly enough, with the advent of one Vladimir Putin to the presidency of Russia, renewed interest and money was put into the Northern Fleet to strengthen that area in the north, which goes in quite well with some of the other things that we're discussing really about Russia's aspirations in the north and its relationship with Norway on this border. So, Suzanne, one final thing I would ask you, although I have to say I'm going to have to now practice my own pronunciation. You were mentioning earlier something about Svalbard, and I need you to explain that to me.
Thank you, Ali. Svalbard, as you know, is used to be known as Spitsbergen, and that's a group of islands due north, so in between Norway and the North Pole, and it's famous for its polar bears. It was defined, and it was kind of given to Norway in the Spitsbergen Treaty, or not given to Norway, but it became clear that it was Norwegian in the Spitsbergen Treaty of 1920, which was later renamed the Svalbard Treaty. And it gave sovereignty to Norway, but under strict conditions, which was that it was to remain a demilitarized zone with no permanent military presence allowed. And all parties to the treaty, which is a lot of them, would have equal rights to commercial activity. And then it became strategically important during World War II, where basically German submarines used to go and hide there to get at the Arctic convoys. And it has about 3,000 people living there. And the only other country with a serious interest in Svalbard is Russia, which still calls it Spitsbergen. It has coal mines there, which it's been mining, and they're sort of Russian coal mining towns, which are quite deserted now, but are Russian coal mining towns on Svalbard. So the reason I wanted to just talk a tiny bit about it before we finished is that these questions about how Norway and Russia are getting on, and I've tried to paint you a fairly calm picture, saying, they agree that they need to cooperate. There's no point in falling out. Well, Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, has over the last few years been making a series of comments about Svalbard, which, when you piece them all together, are just a little bit alarming. And so this, I think, is just something small to watch as it develops. So it started in 2017. They had the Barents Euro-Arctic Council meeting, and Lavrov lashed out at his Norwegian counterpart and said that Russian legitimate rights in the area were being repeatedly restricted. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs had submitted 2 diplomatic notes about Svalbard to the Norwegians, but they'd had no response. They'd called for dialogue, but the Norwegians hadn't responded. And he said, I believe this does not correspond with good neighbourly relations. And then that was 2017, and then in 2020, so 2020 was the 100th anniversary of the Spitsbergen Treaty, and again Lavrov claimed that Oslo had been seeking to limit Russian activity in the area against the treaty's guarantee of equal liberty of access. And it complained about the creation of fishery protection zones, which Norway says are ecological measures. So again, similar issues that, as you have actually on the coast of Scotland, where you're trying to do marine conservation, which means that the fishermen can't go in. But they also complained of interference with Russian helicopter flights and changes in deportation rules targeting Russian citizens. So you've had this complaints coming out and a letter from Lavrov to his Norwegian counterpart, which then seemed to become part of a more coordinated Russian messaging offensive. And I'm going to finish with a quote from Russia's Consul General in Svalbard in 2020, Sergei Gushchin, who gave a lengthy interview to Rossiyskaya Gazeta, where he said that Russians were being increasingly squeezed by local Norwegian authorities. He said there's no outright pressure from the Norwegian side to make Russians leave, but it feels that, we're being disturbed. And he underlines, this is the bit that I thought, just there's some echoes here, which I think we should just think about. He underlines that the Russians have the right to stay in the archipelago and said, Spitsbergen is also our land. It is covered by the blood of our ancestors. So that is the statement from the Russian.
That's not encouraging.
Consul General in Svalbard.
So there seems to be a certain amount of Russian irredentism of or at least imagined irredentism, even to the north. I started this podcast basically thinking that we're dealing with 180 or 190 kilometers of border right at the northern fringes of Europe, with Russia, Norway, of which, really they'd achieved some sort of, modus vivendi, really, and were really, I suppose, in many ways getting on with the environment and resource sharing and this, that, and the other. But as I think you've brilliantly pointed out, this is a vast border. If you go into the Barents Sea and further north and to Spitsbergen and these areas, that it's there are Svalbard, you're quite right. It's an area of huge potential friction, actually. That's what's quite unnerving. And as you say, recent Russian commentary in the context of what's been happening further south in Ukraine and others is probably not as encouraging as it should be. But thank you very much for that real tour de force. And I have to say, it was a bit of an eye-opener. I wasn't expecting it to be quite so intriguing. But there you are. These are these little areas, these geopolitical nuggets that we need to keep an eye on. So I think on that note, it's until next time. That's bye from me and
goodbye from me.